Good day, denizens. Welcome to part 2 of Nationalism and Political Identities in Asia. In this part, we talk about China and compare and contrast it with the Soviet Union. And much of this we're actually talking after World War II, so don't worry, we'll still talk about World War II, but we're just trying to get an idea of how communism worked rolling through much of the course of the 20th century. And basically how China got to the point of having somebody like Chairman Mao Zedong running the show. The Qing dynasty, the last dynasty of China, was really, really weak as we roll into the last half of the 19th century. They had numerous military defeats. Remember the Sino-Japanese War, where the Japanese occupied parts of China, took over Korea, and just obliterated the Chinese. And there were, reforms were very, very slow in China. The Qing dynasty, the various emperors just simply weren't willing to relinquish power, very much like the czars in Russia during the 19th century, where they avoided industrialization and modernization because they thought that it would be a threat to their power. Peasants, resented the policies that seemed to benefit only the elites in China, which makes sense. And there was, lack of support for the Qing government overall. I mean, people didn't trust it in China. So when it started falling apart, there was no sympathy amongst the peasants or even the elites. But China did try to catch up with the West. Remember that the Japanese are going to catch up with the Meiji Restoration. But in China, they try what is called the self-strengthening movement. And this begins in the 1860s, runs through the 1870s. And they do this because they're responding to the spheres of influence that are being carved out of China. The Taiping Rebellion, which tore China apart. And the idea was to, very much like Japan did, borrow Western technology. But at the same time, the Chinese really wanted to maintain their Confucian culture. Of course, in Japan, you had a very similar debate where you had the old school folk who wanted to maintain Japanese culture. There was a fear of losing that. But in China, it's going to be even stronger, this fear of losing that Confucian culture. But nonetheless, with this self-strengthening movement, new schools are going to be built. There will be some, factories built, machines, some industrialization, even a dockyard. And you had, some scholars studying Western sciences and ideas and technologies. Members of the government and some of the elites traveled to the United States, Britain, France, Germany to try to learn how they did things. The Japanese did the same thing. But in the end, this fails in China because basically the Chinese bureaucracy, the Qing dynasty, the emperor, they're just not willing to give up power. Whereas in Japan, they were willing to give up power. They end up modeling their government after Germany, modeling their government or their military after Prussia and France and Britain. So the Japanese were willing to change, but the Chinese under the Qing dynasty, not so much. Well, about 40-some years after the Taiping Rebellion, we're going to have another major rebellion across China, much of northern China, called the Boxer Rebellion. These peoples rose up, these Chinese folk rose up against, they were tired of Christian missionaries. They felt like, Christianity being spread, was in violation of the longer held Confucian beliefs and ideas. They attacked foreign diplomats. They attacked technology, just like the Luddites during the Industrial Revolution in the early 1800s in Britain. Now, the group was actually called the Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists. But the thing is, the Europeans called them boxers, the Westerners called them boxers because of the training tactics that they witnessed with them, these boxers learning different types of karate. By 1900, though, this Boxer Rebellion spreads throughout China, and basically these people, they murdered Japanese and German diplomats, they murdered Catholic priests. As a matter of fact, for a brief time, the empress of the Qing dynasty actually validates and supports these attacks because for her she could gain more power by getting rid of these people. So even though the Boxer Rebellion could have really hurt, obviously, her government, she also saw the advantage that she could gain as well. So basically what happens is a bunch of foreign powers invade China. you actually get 20,000 troops from 8 different countries that come in and take over Beijing. So it's kind of interesting. You get this huge Boxer Rebellion, and because these people are killing officials from Western countries, these Western countries feel validated to come in to protect their own people. But it's also a convenient excuse because remember, the West was making quite a bit of money off of spheres of influence all over China. So the Boxer Rebellion needs to be put down so they can go back to making money. Somewhat similar to the Taiping Rebellion. So yeah, I mean, the French, the UK, Germany, Japanese, the United States even, all these countries sent soldiers into China to put down this rebellion. And basically, the Chinese government is pretty embarrassed. They have to allow the West to occupy their capital for 1 year, and they had to pay $450 million in silver that they didn't have, which really was, as you see there, 5 years of income for the Qing government. But hey, they paid it off in 1940. So at the turn of the century, then, Chinese intellectuals were, challenged by this question of how do you balance Western thought with, Chinese tradition and Confucianism, and that really was at the heart of the issue. Going all the way back to the self-strengthening movement, but even through the Boxer Rebellion, that was always the question for China. How do they maintain their culture, Confucian culture, but also adopt Western ideas, but most especially Western technologies? Well, one guy comes about named Sun Yat-sen, and Sun Yat-sen is a nationalist, a Chinese nationalist, and he is going to form a new political party called the Guomindang, and this party essentially is going to take over once the Qing fall in 1912. In 1911, Sun Yat-sen comes in and creates a new Chinese republic in 1912. And basically, what had happened was you just have all these uprisings all across China. The spirit of nationalism in China becomes very strong because of all the foreign occupation for so much time. So Sun Yat-sen was able to grab hold of that power and that momentum of nationalism and, allow for the Qing to fall. And Sun Yat-sen is able to create this new government. So the Qing are bye-bye. They're the last Chinese dynasty. In 1919, there's a major movement called the May 4th movement, and this is led by a bunch of students and college professors and things like this in the cities across China, and they're once again protesting against foreign interference, now in this case especially against the Japanese. At the end of World War I, during the Versailles Treaty, the Versailles Treaty was run by Woodrow Wilson of the United States, Georges Clemenceau of France, David Lloyd George of Britain. And basically, these three guys, being complete social Darwinists, had no sympathy for any people who weren't Western European. So basically, like the Chinese, for example, territories that were taken from them weren't really given back. Japan had taken these places, and these Western powers at the Treaty of Versailles meeting there just kind of like, just let them have it. And a lot of people are actually incensed. As a matter of fact, the May 4th movement is really inspired by the meetings at Versailles, because Woodrow Wilson had talked about this idea of self-determination. Well, people around the world took that as meaning, oh, good old Woodrow here, he wants us to feel like that if we have the right amount of people and the right nationalist spirit, that we should be able to form our own country. Well, Wilson sort of meant that, but he just didn't mean it for anyone that was not white European. So basically, there's this very brief moment in places like Korea and Saudi Arabia, China, and other places where people are like, whoa, the West is really on our side, until they find out that they're not. And basically, this May 4th movement really rallies people and rallies the Chinese people to this understanding that, look, the West is never going to accept them for who they are. So basically, this really boosts Chinese nationalism and gains even more traction for people like Sun Yat-sen and his nationalist government. So Sun Yat-sen was not a Marxist. He was not a communist. He did obviously want the imperial powers out of China, very popular stance, as you might imagine. But he wanted to see an overall unified China. He wanted to see China develop its own economy run by China, with China profiting from its own economy. But he wanted he had some democratic ideas, universal suffrage. So Sun Yat-sen has all these great ideas, but the problem is he dies. And when Sun Yat-sen dies, there is, in a sense, a power vacuum. He had created this Kuomintang party, as you see up at the top of the slide here. But when he died, party leadership fell over to this guy, Chiang Kai-shek, or Chiang Kai-shek, the guy that you see over here on the left. Now, Chiang Kai-shek, will become eventually an ally of the United States, and that'll make sense later on. But nonetheless, he becomes much more dictatorial than Sun Yat-sen was. And basically, this guy, Kai-shek, just wants to hold a lot of power. And when the other guy that you see there on the right rises to power, a librarian who had been reading up on his Uncle Carl, Mao Zedong, basically he wants to turn China into this communist country, and he had gained a very broad following, as you might imagine. So basically China falls into this massive and rather nasty civil war between the communists and the Kuomintang, or really the nationalists, I guess you could say, led by Kai-shek. And so basically, with China, shredded, torn apart in civil war, well, this leaves China vulnerable and wide open to the Japanese. So the Japanese come in and begin to invade China. They take over Manchuria in 1931. By 1934 to 37, they're well into southern China. But hey, wait a second, we got the League of Nations. The League of Nations is supposed to deal with this, right? They're supposed to keep the Japanese from invading. And when the League of Nations says something, the Japanese say, well, you know what? We're just going to leave the League of Nations. League of Nations, what are you going to do about it? Exactly. So basically then we have this civil war of the nationalists versus the communists. And Chiang Kai-shek, launches this kind of military expedition, I guess, to forcibly unite much of China and to have the Kuomintang rule over all of it. And he begins to attack the Communist Party. He sees the communists as his main obstacle. So he begins just ordering the attack and smashing of communists. But by this point, too, the communists under Mao had formed their own army. It's just what people did back then. And basically, the communists are kind of outnumbered and outmanned, so they basically flee. They go on what is called the Long March or the Great March, and they retreat up into the mountains. This seemingly 80-some thousand man Red Army, communist army, and marched some 6,200 miles in October of 1934, and launching these kind of hit-and-run attacks against the nationalists, the Kuomintang, Chiang Kai-shek's forces, but also, suffering from hunger and disease. But essentially, what's going to happen is, hey, Mao's going to win. It's much more complicated than that. But nonetheless, basically, Mao Zedong, when he takes over in 1949, he's got some different ideas. Now, obviously, the Soviet Union had been around for some time by this point, by 1949. So yeah, we're 4 years after World War II. Don't worry, we're going to talk about World War II. But he didn't agree with how the Soviet Union was being run. He had his own ideas for a communist, Marxist-Leninist China. Especially, Mao believed in empowering the peasants, whereas in the Soviet Union we had more empowerment of urban folk, and it's this kind of empowerment of some elites in the Soviet Union. As a matter of fact, Mao would have viewed the Soviet Union as completely corrupt. Right? And, well, it was. But Mao comes to power when he finally wins the Chinese Civil War in 1949. And what that means for Chiang Kai-shek is he flees. Chiang Kai-shek, who had actually been supported throughout World War II during the Japanese coming in there, and then after by the United States because, well, Chiang Kai-shek was not communist. Chiang Kai-shek may have been a ruthless, murderous tyrant, but hey, he's not communist, and that's U.S. policy during the 20th century, especially after World War II. So Chiang Kai-shek has to flee, he and his forces, and they flee to an island known as Taiwan, or Formosa for you old schoolers. But when they flee to Taiwan, the United States recognizes Taiwan as China. Taiwan, no, China. But it's Taiwan, but it's China. Yeah. In other words, that big area that's China, that's not China anymore, the United States does not recognize because after 1949, it is controlled by Mao Zedong and the communists. And this has been extremely controversial to this day. The United States still recognizes Taiwan as an independent country. The country of China today sees Taiwan as a rogue province, and China claims that it has the right to invade Taiwan and take it back and force it to be compliant anytime that it likes. And there are quite a few armaments pointed at Taiwan on the Chinese coast. And the United States has continued to boost up the Taiwanese military. And, the big question is, if China were to finally pull the trigger, no pun intended, and, attack Taiwan to force its compliance, does the United States then go to war with China? But nonetheless, I digress, and let's get back to the story here. So basically, Mao and the communists win the Civil War. In Russia, in the meantime, the Soviet Union, peasants had already redistributed land amongst themselves, right? And the Bolsheviks basically said, okay, you keep that now. And remember, Lenin had some kulaks. He created this kind of small kulak class as well that Stalin destroys. But nonetheless, China's process is going to be much longer, much more difficult, and much more painful. Basically, once Mao comes into power, we just get these communist teams, more like gangs, I guess, that just start roaming the countryside, and they try to inspire and mobilize the peasants to attack landlords, to attack people who held wealth and power across the countryside. So 3 years after the Chinese Civil War, after Mao's victory in 1949, in 1952 you have about 1 to 2 million landlords that are killed by these communist quote-unquote teams, I guess, that are just roaming out in the countryside. So you have a state of virtual anarchy in the Chinese countryside, and there's a lot of countryside. And what Mao decides to do is, once he's running the show, well, just like the Soviet Union, he decides to collectivize agriculture. He gets rid of all private property, as opposed to in the USSR, where you did have some kulaks with some power. Technically, there's no private property, but the Politburo had quite a bit of power in the Soviet Union. You could tell because they would always drive around in Mercedes, and other Russian folk would say, hey, what kind of car is that? Nonetheless, once Mao is in power, it's a relatively peaceful process at first, ending private property and things like that, but that peacefulness is not going to last very long. There had been a close relationship between peasants and the Communist Party because Mao was all about the peasant, right? And the USSR, in their attempt to collectivize, it's violent, right? The Ukraine refuses, and Stalin cuts it off and starves people to death, right? Peasants hoard food in the Soviet Union during their collectivization efforts. Stalin orders the massacre of all the kulaks, or he opens up the gulags, the Russian prisons, and sends people there. So I guess, relatively speaking, China's collectivization effort is a little more peaceful, relatively. So just a little compare and contrast. Not that the AP test would ever have you do anything like that. But of the Soviet Union and of Chinese collectivization. So China goes way, way further than the Soviet Union goes with collectivization. As a matter of fact, Mao begins a program in the late 50s called the Great Leap Forward, and it's going to go backward. Because of this Great Leap Forward, where basically he creates these huge communes all across China. So in other words, there's these kind of large collections of peoples. Just imagine, I guess like Johns Creek and Alpharetta and a couple other local towns all merged into one big commune, right? Where everybody just distributes all of their stuff to one central location and then distributes it back out for equality, right? So these communes are created, and the idea is that Mao is trying to create this communist society, right, with pure equality. But the problem is that the administration running the show here, or lack thereof, it's chaotic. The markets that had been there, where the Chinese had traded, with each other, are disrupted. So basically, chains or linkages of trade are broken down. So people suddenly aren't getting what they were getting in terms of food. And then we have poor weather, and that's going to lead to at least 20 million people dead across China from 1959 to 1962 in this great leap forward. But, like the Soviet Union, Stalin does industrialize the Soviet Union at a great, great cost. That's also Mao's goal. Both of them said, look, we have to industrialize. That is fundamental, that is core, that is sacrosanct for the survival of our country. Both the Chinese and Soviet Union would have thought, or did think. And basically, you have to move the country, into this socialist phase, have a military and forcibly equalize society. Both of them are going to do this. And basically what China was doing in the 1950s to do that, they sort of do what the Soviet Union did in the 20s and 30s with the Kulak idea, but it's not going to last. But nonetheless, what China does is they take over all property. They're going to redistribute it, or try to. They create 5-year plans, just like in the Soviet Union. They prioritize, heavy industry, with the Communist Party in total control, very much like in the Soviet Union. And basically just this kind of mass mobilization of humans, right, to do work, to build massive. That's what these guys were all about, the Chinese and the Soviet Union. Under communism, they were just these massive, massive projects to build a massive dam, like to dam up a river, or huge bridges, and it would always be a massive undertaking at a huge human cost and also very detrimental to the environment. But because of this, in both places, it does create tremendous economic growth. Education grows in both the Soviet Union and in China. Literacy rates shoot up. Opportunities for education for women as well also shoot up greatly. And obviously social mobility, because, everybody's technically equal, I guess. And basically, we do see some urbanization, though Mao despises the urban places. Exploitation of the countryside to feed the cities is going to happen, most especially in the Soviet Union. And we're going to see by default a creation of bureaucrats who become elites. The more things change, the more they stay the same. Because isn't that the problem the Qing Empire was having? And with the whole bureaucratic elite thing, people taking more than they're supposed to, isn't that the same issue that Russia had under the czars with their nobles? Yeah. So just kind of breaking it down. So basically, once the Soviet Union goes through collectivization, the social outcomes of it are just kind of accepted. Stalin and later on Khrushchev, these guys just kind of like, okay, well, you know what? Here's what we got. Here's what we got to accept. And that was problematic to Mao, because what the Soviet Union was accepting were things like the Politburo, which was the Soviet communist government, having a whole bunch of extremely wealthy people, which doesn't make sense because everyone's supposed to be equal, right? But the guys running the government, they're driving around in Mercedes. They're getting access to food and liquors made in the West that other people would never have access to, in the Soviet Union, and, in furniture and vehicles, all kinds of, perks. When this started in China, though, Mao would not stand it, and Mao is going to lash out against that. In the USSR, industrialization really focused on urban areas. In China, Mao focused urbanization on the countryside with the blast furnaces. And, in terms of differences, Stalin at first encouraged individual competition with the kulaks, and then he wiped them all out. In China, you get this great leap forward because Mao wants pure, complete equality. He doesn't like the idea of having any semblance of an elite class. In the Soviet Union, by the time we get into the 60s and 70s, the whole idea of having an egalitarian society, in other words, a classless, equal society, it's pretty much just abandoned. Soviet Union's kind of like, okay, this didn't really work, but we, as in the people who hold the money, we're just going to make sure that we're able to keep our money. And obviously, hypocrisy is going to reign supreme in the USSR. I mean, the people who have to live under this system, they can see what's going on, and they realize, just what hypocrites the Politburo, the government in charge, is. However, over in China, what's going to happen in the 1960s is what Mao calls the Great Proletarian Revolution, where basically there's this huge lashing out against perceived capitalists. And in these communist societies, or attempted communist societies, you would have seen a lot of propaganda like this put out by the Soviet Union once Lenin comes in with the 1917 revolution there, and of course Mao and the Chinese communists coming in as well. And some of the propaganda that they would espouse is like what you see here, this idea that women are treated equally in the communist society, as opposed to, say, what they were pointing out here is in the West, where you saw women not being treated as equals, not having voting rights, things like this. The United States, women didn't get voting rights until 1919. So you see a lot of some of these Western European countries, like for example in Britain, women gained the right to vote in like localized elections in the late 1880s, 1888 or so. But then it's not until the late 1920s that women, over 21 are finally allowed to vote, in national elections and basically have the same voting rights as men. So we see, in some of these countries, France is going to be late as well, giving voting rights to women. So what these communist countries are trying to say is, look, we give women equal rights. And, to an extent, it was more liberating for women in these communist countries. The problem is wealth wasn't exactly well distributed in these places, as we talked about earlier. But then as also, what you would have heard in these communist countries is that, in the West, women didn't have job opportunities. Women, for example, in the United States, were starting to get opportunities as secretaries and, of course, teachers, things like that. But in terms of jobs like what you see here, a chemist, a scientist, very rarely were you seeing women in Western countries getting those types of opportunities, say for like a Marie Curie in France, something like that. Or looking at the United States, most especially women not getting many opportunities, which leads in the 1950s, to the beginnings of the massive women's rights movement. And then, of course, it explodes in the 60s. So that's the type of propaganda you would have seen in these type of communist countries. You look, too, at the one on the far left, women as industrial workers, right? So the thing is that, everyone gets to work equally, even if it is, grueling, difficult labor as well, which these communist countries were definitely well attuned to. And the two most prominent ones that we're pointing out here, China and the Soviet Union, really are run by two madmen. Joseph Stalin, who comes to power in 1927, 28, a few years after Lenin's death. There's a big power play in the Politburo, which is the Soviet communist government. Big power play. Stalin is able to, make the right maneuvers to get the right political allies so that he can maneuver into power. And of course, that comes with blood, death, and killing, as it usually does in these places. As a matter of fact, his main political opponent, Leon Trotsky, is exiled. And then later on in the 1930s, Trotsky, living in Mexico City, ends up with an ice pick in the back of his head from one of Stalin's agents. Stalin, definitely not a nice guy, sent millions to the gulags. The gulags were these prison camps. It says Siberia. Not all of them were in Siberia, but the harshest of them, and most of them, were in Siberia. One of the worst being Kolyma Gulag, where tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of people died, where essentially people were working in negative 40, 50 degree weather to mine for gold for the Politburo, for the Soviet government. And then on top of that, Stalin carried out what has come to be called the Great Purge. Historians have differed on just how many people he ordered murdered. It used to be as high as like 10 million. Some historians back in the 70s and 80s were arguing. And that was in large part because, the Soviet Union was very secretive with its records. Historians didn't have access. As the Soviet Union opened up a little bit under Gorbachev in the late 80s. And then, of course, once the Soviet Union fell by the end of 1991, more of those records came out. And Stalin's purges probably killed low end 750,000 or so, high end, maybe 1.5 million. So he wiped out about 1 million of his people, right there in the mid to late 1930s. People who he argued were political opponents or anyone who threatened his power. And Stalin would just keep, these large lists of human beings that he would just write out. And send to his henchmen, who would then go across the countryside, his secret police, and pull people out of their homes, usually men, heads of household, and just kill them. It's not uncommon. It wasn't uncommon, at least in the 90s, to still find some mass graves from Stalin's purges. Even during World War II, when the Nazis had invaded the Soviet Union, they came across one of these mass graves from Stalin's purges and actually tried to publicize it, saying that, see, the Russians, they're the bad guys, not the Nazis. When, of course, it turns out they're both pretty damn evil. But nonetheless, Stalin, very vicious, brutal dictator. And then you get Mao Zedong, who, as we talked about earlier, he comes to power in the midst of the Chinese Civil War. And you got to remember, too, China, the Chinese Civil War is going on in the late 1920s into the 1930s, Mao versus Chiang Kai-shek, Jiang Jieshi. And in the midst of that, becomes World War II when China is invaded by Japan. But then, once World War II ends, by 1949, Mao is successful in the Chinese Civil War, and he comes to power and begins to install his version of communism. But his version of communism is a good deal different, as we saw previously, than Stalin's, though it still comes with high levels of death, sadly. Under Mao, he came out with his own ideas and objectives of how to create the ideal communist state. These were collected in something called the Red Book, and you were expected to carry the little Red Book around with you. As a matter of fact, when Mao starts some of his initiatives like the Great Leap Forward, which is more backward than forward, you actually had these roving gangs of teenagers, literally, who were just full of zeal and fanaticism of spreading communism, and they would go into villages and smash the leadership there, embarrass people who they deemed to be too capitalistic. They would parade them through the streets and beat them, punish them, kill them, everything else. So overall, Mao's policies, we still don't know to this day. Historians vary anywhere from 20 to 50 million people. Just terrible. So these two guys, two of the biggest mass murderers in human history, and they both happen to rule about the same time in world history. But nonetheless, so we have some similarities in these communist countries in terms of industrialization. Both the Soviet Union and Communist China, they would take on these huge projects. And when I mean huge, we're talking about clearing miles of land to build massive factories, huge hydroelectric dams, and at huge human costs and environmental costs. These people actually viewed, these communist governments viewed nature as kind of an enemy, something to be overcome, something to dominate and take control of. That nature was this enemy, and that communism could kind of rearrange the living world. So you would just see these huge projects, and humans just kind of become the ones working on the projects. They're more of a means to an end. It's not the importance of the individual; it's the importance of the state and the state's existence. Magnitogorsk was the biggest of these industrial complexes in the Soviet Union, and I mean the pollution emitted from this place, just terrible, into the water, into the air. It wasn't uncommon for the Soviet Union to build their nuclear power plants near rivers so that they could just run nuclear waste straight off into the waterways. And they would even pay like local village people to go down to the waterways and take samples of the water and turn that into your local government. Of course, the people didn't know why they were measuring the water. They just knew they were getting money for doing it. But you would just have huge outbreaks of cancer in these towns, and untold hundreds of thousands end up dying from this as well. Also in the Soviet Union, in the what is today the country of Uzbekistan, the Aral Sea was this huge body of water. Well, it was a sea. But what ends up happening there is because of the huge demand for cotton cultivation in the region of Uzbekistan. Uzbekistan would have been one of the states of the 17 states of the Soviet Union. Because of the huge, output of cotton. Well, cotton requires a lot of water, and in this case, the Aral Sea basically was drained for this cotton cultivation. And today, you see like overhead satellite views of the Aral Sea, and you can just see how much it has disappeared. And a lot of this too, culminates in a massive disaster, their Chernobyl disaster in 1986, this huge nuclear explosion in the Soviet Union that the Soviets tried their best to cover up. But it's usually difficult to cover up a nuclear explosion and radioactive nuclear meltdown. And you can see here the huge extent of Chernobyl, all the way into far northern Sweden. Radiation was detected. As a matter of fact, the day after Chernobyl, you had nuclear scientists going to work across Europe and even in Sweden. And there was one particular nuclear plant in Sweden where the scientists, the workers would go in every single day, and every day that you would go to work, you would go through a detector, and it would send off an alarm if you had too much radiation on you. Well, after years and years of the alarm never really going off, except for when they tested it, all these guys are coming into work, and all of a sudden the alarm keeps going ding, 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 ding. And these workers are like, oh, no, it's got to be, this thing's messing up. The detector is screwed up or something, right? But it turned out that Chernobyl had just happened, and their metal detector, or rather their radiation detector, was spot on. That's how serious the radiation had spread out of the Chernobyl disaster. And there you can see the remnants of an area around Chernobyl there. And you can see Chernobyl in the background from courtesy Wikipedia here image. But to this day, Chernobyl is still pretty much a wasteland. Yeah, you can just see how many people were displaced, and no telling how many were killed, from the initial explosion and then from the release of radiation, because Soviet Union was just so secretive, of this. But nonetheless, you can see the total devastation of this town, just totally abandoned, or city totally abandoned. And yeah, like we said, the radiation all the way to Sweden, as far south as Italy. And what the Soviets basically tried to do is just cover the whole thing in tons and tons of concrete. Where, as far as I know, still like that today. And just the terrible damage done. But looking at these two communist countries here, both Mao and Stalin had a lot in common in terms of only seeking out enemies, and what they would call enemies of the revolution. In other words, the revolution is to pull off the creation of this communist state. So anyone who would be an enemy, or someone who would be an enemy, would be anyone who accumulated wealth or tried to start a business or make profit for themselves. They would have been characterized as an enemy, or people who would have had some kind of noble type status or high status in society, because the idea is pure equality, right? And that's what leads to Stalin's purges, or Mao's crazies across the countryside going out and just arbitrarily killing millions of people. they would call these targets, foreign imperialists, right? The people trying to bring in democracy or capitalism, the elites, these types of people. And both Mao and Stalin had different ways of viewing their own inner circle, and the same too. They both were, murderous, and one day you would think that they trusted you, and the next day they're, going to kill you. But Mao had this constant fear of, within his own Communist Party that, they were being, quote, seduced by capitalist values. So there would be these kind of purges of the party. Whereas the Politburo, the Soviet Union, their kind of leadership, by the time we get into the 60s and 70s, it's kind of plain that the whole government's just corrupt. And basically, there is capitalism in the Soviet Union, but just amongst the main government officials who are telling everyone else to be communist. It wasn't uncommon to see Politburo politicians, riding around in a Bentley, living in a nice dacha or having a nice home, while the vast majority of the people just live in squalor. And if you're lucky enough to have a car, it's a crappy Soviet-made car. Nobody wanted those vehicles. Bouncing back to China, the so-called Red Guard, many of these young people roaming the countryside and murdering. But, at the same time, these kind of brutal tactics also contribute to downfall, right? Mao himself, the problem that the Chinese government falls into with Mao is that they play him up so much in propaganda that the Chinese people view him with almost kind of godlike status. So, once they realize that this guy's, a little bit too crazy and overzealous and murdering so many people, it's difficult for them to kind of, push him aside and kind of de-emphasize him. But nonetheless, people aren't just going to lie down and just take this, right? So you are going to have uprisings and some people trying to go against the system and challenge the system. With Mao, like we've said here, just the violence on the countryside and everything else. But the other thing to point out here is just more specifically some of Mao's big initiatives, and maybe the biggest one with the Great Leap Forward that started in the late 50s. And the idea here was collectivization. In other words, they wanted to collectivize production, namely in agriculture. Mao believed that the communist revolution had to be through the peasantry, whereas the Soviet Union took a more elite, through the people who are more educated and learned, more urban people, that they're the ones who should kind of lead the revolution. Nonetheless, Mao and Stalin did this too, just 20 years earlier, 25 years earlier. 30, I guess, years earlier, this collectivization of the countryside, where basically you would have these large, massive miles and miles of farmland where you have peasants farming these areas, but they would gather up all the crops and they were forced to then ship all those crops to a centralized location. And then from that centralized location, then the food and the crops was to be shipped out and distributed equally and evenly, right? This is collectivization. The problem here is that if you don't have, excellent transportation networks and communication networks and organization, you're going to have millions starve to death. And basically that's what happened. And then on top of that, you have people who say, hey, I'm not going to participate in this. I need to feed my family. So they start hoarding food and hoarding goods. And, this could come with dire consequences in both the Soviet Union and China, where you would get people who would come to the local village in one collective and, track down people who were hoarding goods, hiding goods. And you could be, ridiculed, beaten, executed, killed, for doing this. But overall, in both the Soviet Union and China, we're talking tens of millions who are going to die in these collectivization efforts. And, in large part because of just the lack of infrastructure to transport food and goods, but also the non-cooperation. And also it's just not a very workable idea. Turns out people need food pretty regularly. And it's interesting too, at the start of this whole Great Leap Forward, see an image here from good old Wikipedia again, where you would actually have these, communal kitchens and communal gatherings, and people were pretty gung ho. The peasants, really rah rah sis boom ba about, supporting this whole movement, and you could eat for free, right? You come to the commune canteen, basically the cafeteria, and get free food, and then go back to your day of laboring. But of course, this is very short-lived, relatively speaking, because production is going to slow down. You have people who aren't very motivated to produce, or if they are, they're only producing for their own family. And there was so much enthusiasm that flashlights and headlamps and things were handed out to the peasants so that they could work all day during sunlight, but then work during the night in the dark, working in the fields using their night lamps. Like I said, they're charged and fired up at the beginning. And the other big thing in China, out in the countryside, was this movement to produce steel. And basically you would see these so-called backyard furnaces, and Mao had this great idea that, obviously, the peasants are to lead the revolution according to Mao's version of communism, but, they can do more than just create crops, right? They can also create their own steel. So you'd see these furnaces. The problem is, the steel was just junk. Steel needs very, very high heat. It also needs an exacting process to remove any type of impurities, and some little backyard barbecue furnace, just isn't going to get it done. So a lot of the stuff that was produced just wasn't any good.